Hello and welcome to everybody who joins us today for our Bible study together. Today we conclude our time looking into the book of Philippians with chapter 4. We've reached the fourth and final chapter of Paul's letter to the church of Philippa. And most of this chapter is concerned with Paul's final greetings and shoutouts to various members of the church and the Christian community as a whole. And there's two names that we should pay close attention to. Paul calls out to Euodia and Syntyche, who have struggled alongside Paul in the work of the gospel. And these names are important, possibly not quite so much in this particular letter, but in regards to all of Paul's writing. There's a great number of passages which portray people, specifically women, in a subservient role, and these two names are the names of women. Perhaps the best example of what I'm talking about is in his letter to Timothy, where he writes, "I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silence." I find it a little bit disappointing to read these statements, and I'm sure most of you do as well, and more so because we find them within our scriptures. Paul seems to go back and forth in his support of women in ministry, and for many years the arguments against women held sway. Throughout the time between Paul's writing and today, though, many have argued against Paul's decisions, and we can see the result of this in the many women who are called and accepted as ministers, not only with the United Church of Canada, but other denominations as well. One of the strongest arguments against Paul's seeming denunciation of female ministers was raised by Domenica Narducci de Paradiso. As a result of a divine revelation she received, she pointed to Paul's own writings in the Church of Corinthians, chapter 1, 25 to 29, where Paul tells the church that God's most foolish actions are far wiser than our own human wisdom. And later in 2 Corinthians 3:17, Paul writes, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." And combined, these two statements call for anybody whom God calls to whatever task to be viewed as proper. And who are we to argue against the will of the Creator? And so, how are we to interpret the wisdom and teaching of Paul? Certainly there's a great deal that we can learn in these scripture passages, but we should keep two things in mind. And the first is that Paul is firmly rooted in the time and society in which he lived. And while he personally may have escaped, or at least partially escaped, the teachings and the traditions of the Judaic church in which he was born and raised, it's still a great influence for many of the people in the early Christian church and the communities which surround them. But just as Paul learned to grow beyond those early teachings, we have that opportunity to be more than what we were taught as well. In the days of Paul already, we can see that sacrifices need no longer be made for forgiveness. They've been abolished. The traditions of circumcisions are no longer needed, and many of those other traditional rites and ceremonies are somewhat outdated. Anyone who reads through the book of Leviticus would find that many of the punishments listed there are barbaric and unacceptable for us in this day and age. Leviticus calls for us to stone and burn and mutilate and kill many people in the name of the law. And a society can raise above what came before it in those early days, and we can continue to do that in our day. The second thing is that although Paul's letter to us are in their scriptures, they weren't really written for us. They were, after all, written to churches and to communities and individuals in Paul's world. They contain such a great volume of wisdom that they were chosen to be included in the Bible, though. We also need to remember that some of those letters that went back and forth between Paul and the churches are lost forever. Those are the letters that came outside those messages that are in the scriptures. Even those that we can find outside of those mentioned in the scriptures weren't included as part of the Bible. So what we're reading in these passages, possibly only a portion of a conversation that was ongoing. It's kind of like hearing someone talking on the phone that we only get one side of the conversation that we can hear. And even in that, we only have an idea of what's going on right now. We don't know what happened before or after. With this in mind, it's possible that some of the writings that Paul puts out are not general for everybody, but directed at answering specific questions that we don't know about earlier in conversations. But I think we're getting a little bit far away from Philippians, so let's have another look at the chapter 4 with this in mind as we finish off for today. This chapter is Paul's closing of the letter, and he gives final well wishes and asks the church to continue doing the work that it's doing and to not worry but to trust in God. We can see many of the other people being mentioned, places and events that Paul wants to bring up. And this is just further evidence that this is not a letter for everybody, but a specific group and people at a specific point in time. So, does this mean that it has nothing for us? Well, of course not, but we do need to be careful and not assume that it is entirely for us. And you might ask, what's the point of Paul's letter? Well, that's entirely the point. Well, maybe not entirely, but it's part of the point, and that is to ask, to question, to ponder, to meditate upon, to learn. Jesus tells us, ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. Asking questions is not an absence of faith, but it's a way to build our faith, to learn more, to expand and to grow. We may not fully ever understand the entire meaning of God's message to us in this lifetime, but unless we're willing to explore it, to ask these questions, we are going to miss out on the opportunity to grow. I thank you for joining us in this short series of reflections on the book of Philippians, and I hope that it has left you with more questions than when you started. But I also hope that it's led to at least a few answers along the way as well. Our next series of reflections, which begins next week, will lead us through the Advent season up to the birth of Jesus Christ. And I hope that you'll join us again for the journey. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.